In the summer of 1959, a convoy of Army engineers arrived on the northwest coast of Greenland carrying construction equipment that had never been tested in Arctic conditions. They were not building a road. They were not building an airstrip. They were not there to establish a weather monitoring outpost in any meaningful sense. They were there to disappear. Their mission, classified at the highest levels of the United States government and concealed entirely from the sovereign nation whose territory they were standing on, was to drill downward through the Greenland ice sheet and carve out an entire city beneath the surface. A city powered by nuclear energy. A city designed to hide the single most destabilizing weapon system of the Cold War, less than 1,000 miles from Moscow. The base they built was called Camp Century, and for nearly 3 decades after it was abandoned, it did not officially exist. To understand why the United States Army decided to bury an entire military installation beneath the world's second largest ice sheet, you have to understand the strategic reality that defined 1958. The Soviet Union had just successfully launched Sputnik. They had demonstrated, conclusively, that they could place a payload in orbit above the American heartland. If they could put a satellite in space, they could put a thermonuclear warhead on a ballistic trajectory toward any city in the continental United States. The era of geographic immunity was over. The American strategic response to this development was immediate and frantic. The Air Force rushed to deploy B-52 bombers on continuous airborne alert, keeping nuclear-armed aircraft in the sky at all hours so that a Soviet first strike could never destroy the entire deterrent force on the ground. The Navy began developing the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile program, seeking to hide a nuclear strike capability beneath the ocean surface. The Army, unwilling to cede relevance in the nuclear age, proposed something far more audacious. They proposed hiding an entire nuclear arsenal inside a country that was not the United States. If the engineering mechanics and the geopolitical deception behind the Cold War's most hidden military programs fascinate you, consider subscribing as we continue to reconstruct these declassified operations, using the original engineering documents and intelligence records that shaped global history. The strategic logic driving what would eventually be designated Project Iceworm was elegant in its ruthlessness. The Greenland ice sheet is not simply a layer of frozen water sitting on top of rock. It is a massive continental glacier, in some places over 3 kilometers thick, covering an area of roughly 1.7 million square kilometers. It is an impenetrable, featureless white surface that absorbs radar signals, negates optical reconnaissance, and stretches from horizon to horizon in every direction. To a strategic planner at the Pentagon in 1958, it was the perfect hiding place. The theoretical concept proposed by the Army Corps of Engineers was this: if you could carve a network of tunnels through the compacted ice deep below the surface, you could position mobile nuclear ballistic missiles on rail systems running through those tunnels. The missiles would be constantly moving. They could never be precisely located by Soviet reconnaissance satellites. If a Soviet first strike were ever launched, the missiles would survive, because their exact position at any given moment would be unknown. And critically, those missiles would be positioned geographically so that their flight time to targets in the Soviet Union would be measured in minutes, not hours. The plan called for an eventual network of tunnels stretching over 4,000 kilometers beneath the ice. The system would house up to 600 Iceman nuclear ballistic missiles, each carrying a thermonuclear warhead. The name Project Iceworm was chosen for its precision. Like a worm moving through the earth, the missile trains would be perpetually in motion, perpetually hidden, perpetually threatening. But before you can hide 600 nuclear missiles beneath an ice sheet, you first have to prove that you can survive beneath an ice sheet. That was the purpose of Camp Century. Put yourself in the position of an Army Corps engineer assigned to this project in the spring of 1959. You are being asked to construct a habitable functional military installation, not on the ice, but inside it. You are being asked to do this in a location where surface temperatures regularly fall below minus 40 degrees Celsius, where winds routinely exceed 150 kilometers per hour, and where the ice sheet itself is not static. It moves. The entire Greenland glacier flows slowly but continuously toward the ocean under its own immense gravitational weight. You are being asked to build something permanent inside something that is inherently, imperceptibly, but continuously in motion. The engineering methodology developed by the Army Polar Research and Development Center to solve this problem was designated the cut and cover technique. The concept was straightforward in principle and extraordinarily demanding in execution. Large snow-cutting machines, essentially massive horizontal chainsaws mounted on tracked vehicles, would be driven along a predetermined surface route. They would cut a trench approximately 8 meters wide and 9 meters deep through the compacted ice and snow. A prefabricated steel arch structure designed to span the trench would then be lowered into position and bolted together by construction crews working in temperatures that caused steel to become dangerously brittle. The trench would then be backfilled with compacted snow over the top of the arch, burying the structure completely. What remained beneath the surface was a covered tunnel, insulated, protected from the wind, and accessible from the surface only through vertical shafts. 21 of these tunnels were eventually constructed at Camp Century, ranging in length from short equipment bays to the Main Street corridor, which stretched nearly 300 meters. Inside these tunnels, the Army engineers installed prefabricated wooden buildings, essentially barracks modules that were slid into the tunnel's hole and bolted in place against the arching steel walls. The result was a subterranean complex that contained dormitories for 200 men, a kitchen and dining facility, a hospital, a barbershop, a movie theater, a church, and a library. None of this was the most extraordinary engineering achievement at Camp Century. The most extraordinary achievement was the power plant. The United States Army erected the world's first mobile nuclear reactor under the Greenland ice sheet. The reactor, designated PM-2A and nicknamed Nuki Poo by the engineers who maintained it, was designed by the Alco Products Division of a New York industrial manufacturer and engineered to be transported in sections by standard Air Force cargo aircraft. It was assembled on site inside a dedicated tunnel and began generating power in October 1960. It produced 1.5 megawatts of electricity, enough to power a small American city. And it did so using enriched uranium fuel rods that required replacement only once every 2 years. The practical benefits of nuclear power in this environment were immense. A conventional diesel generator requires a continuous supply of fuel. In the Arctic, fuel resupply is an air operation that is entirely dependent on weather conditions. Storms that close airfields for weeks at a time are not unusual in northwestern Greenland. An installation that ran on diesel was an installation that could be starved of power during a 2-week blizzard. The nuclear reactor eliminated this vulnerability. It was also far more efficient, generating vastly more power per kilogram of fuel than any combustion system. The excess thermal energy from the reactor's coolant loops was routed into the camp's heating and water systems. Thousands of gallons of fresh water were melted daily from the ice surrounding the tunnels, using heat bled directly off the reactor's secondary coolant circuit. This was not a research outpost. This was a proof of concept for an underground nuclear missile installation. But the official documentation sent to the Danish government, which held formal sovereignty over Greenland under a 1951 bilateral defense agreement with the United States, described Camp Century entirely as a scientific research platform. The documents described experiments in Arctic glaciology, atmospheric science, and cold weather construction techniques, all of which were real. The Army did conduct legitimate scientific research at the base. Engineers and glaciologists extracted ice cores that yielded genuine and important data about historical climate patterns. The science was not fabricated. The weapons program was simply never mentioned. The Danish government was not informed that the installation was a cover. They were not told about Project Iceworm. They were not told that the long-term plan involved deploying 600 nuclear warheads on their territory. The 1951 Defense Agreement explicitly prohibited the United States from stationing nuclear weapons in Greenland without prior Danish consent. The architects of Project Iceworm were aware of this clause. They proceeded regardless. This was a sovereign deception conducted at the highest levels of the United States government against a close NATO ally. The construction crews working inside Camp Century were not entirely aware of the full scope of the project either. Many of the enlisted men who spent rotations at the base genuinely believed they were serving at a remote scientific research station with unusual infrastructure. The nuclear reactor was certainly unusual, but it was presented as a practical engineering solution to a logistical problem. It was not presented as the prototype for a continental nuclear deployment system. The men who lived at Camp Century during its operational years between 1960 and 1966 described an environment of profound strangeness. The tunnels were lit by fluorescent lighting that ran continuously, creating a perpetual artificial day that bore no relationship to the Arctic surface conditions above. The temperature inside the tunnels was maintained at a relatively comfortable level, but the surrounding walls were not static. As the ice pressed inward under its own weight, and as the slight seasonal movement of the glacier shifted the tunnel geometry, the prefabricated steel arches groaned and clicked under constant low-level pressure. The sounds were described by multiple accounts as deeply unsettling, a low, continuous creaking from every direction. The sound of an environment that was alive in some geological sense, slowly absorbing the structure being forced into it. Frost formed continuously on the interior surfaces of the tunnels wherever warm air met the ice. Maintenance crews spent significant portions of their working hours chipping accumulated ice off critical mechanical components. The floor of the main tunnel corridor was a compacted ice surface, and crew members moved between facilities on foot in heavy Arctic boots or by driving small tracked vehicles. The smell of the facility was universally described as a specific combination of jet fuel from surface resupply flights, diesel exhaust from backup generators running during reactor maintenance cycles, and the particular metallic cold of deep ice. Despite these environmental pressures, the men rotated through Camp Century reported something closer to boredom as their primary operational challenge. The isolation was absolute. Communications with the outside world were limited. Mail arrived by aircraft when weather permitted. The movie theater ran the same small library of films on a rotating schedule until crews had memorized the dialogue. There were no pools, no saunas, no amenities beyond the functional minimums. This was a Cold War Army facility, and the doctrine of the Cold War Army had no patience for comfort. But the technical problem eating at the Project Iceworm planners had nothing to do with crew morale. It had to do with the ice itself. The glaciologists and structural engineers who had been monitoring the tunnel integrity since 1960 began reporting findings that directly contradicted the foundational assumptions of the entire project. The Greenland ice sheet did not behave like the permafrost or frozen ground that Army cold weather engineers had previously worked in. It was not static at any meaningful timescale. The glacier was not a solid, fixed mass with predictable properties. It was a slowly flowing crystalline medium, and it was flowing continuously in ways that the initial engineering surveys had not fully accounted for. The tunnels were deforming. As the immense overburdened pressure of the ice above bore down on the steel arch structures, the arches were not simply holding their shape. They were being slowly crushed. The geometry of the tunnels was changing measurably from season to season, and in some locations from week to week. Survey measurements taken along the main corridor showed that the tunnel cross-sections were decreasing. The walls were moving inward. In technical terms, the ice was experiencing plastic flow, a process by which ice under sufficient pressure deforms slowly over time like an extremely viscous fluid rather than fracturing like a brittle solid. The engineering implications of this were catastrophic for Project Iceworm. The entire strategic premise of the missile deployment plan rested on the assumption that tunnels cut through the ice sheet could be maintained at a standard gauge, wide enough to accommodate missile transport vehicles on rail systems. If the tunnels were actively deforming, the rail gauge would shift, vehicles would derail, missiles could not be moved. The mobile nature of the deterrent, the feature that made it survivable against a Soviet first strike, was entirely dependent on movement. If the missiles could not move, they were simply fixed targets buried under ice instead of fixed targets sitting on the surface. The Army classified the deformation data immediately. Engineers worked frantically to model the flow rates and calculate whether a sustainable maintenance program could counter the ice movement. The conclusion was unavoidable. To maintain the tunnels at a usable cross-section would require a continuous, massive, and extraordinarily expensive remediation effort. Crews would have to re-excavate and reshore thousands of meters of tunnel on a cycle measured in months rather than years. And the underlying glacier, indifferent to the calculations of Army engineers, would continue flowing toward the ocean at the same rate regardless of what maintenance was performed. By 1966, the mathematics were settled. Project Iceworm was physically impossible. The Army Corps of Engineers filed their final assessment with the Pentagon in the summer of 1966. The conclusion was definitive and stark. The ice sheet was not a stable medium for long-term tunnel construction. The deformation rates exceeded any maintenance solution that could be economically or logistically sustained. Project Iceworm was canceled. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. The men packed their personal equipment, loaded the reactor fuel rods onto cargo aircraft for transport back to the United States, and flew out. The tunnels, the prefabricated buildings, the hospital, the movie theater, the barber shop, the library, they were simply left where they were. So was everything else. And this is where the historical record transitions from the story of a Cold War deception into the story of an environmental time bomb. When the Army engineers vacated Camp Century in 1967, they left behind everything that could not fit on an aircraft. The assumption underlying this decision, an assumption that was entirely reasonable given the scientific understanding of 1967, was that the material left inside the tunnels would be buried progressively deeper by annual snowfall. The ice sheet accumulates new snow every year. Over decades, the abandoned camp would be covered by increasingly thick layers of new ice. Within a century or two, it would be hundreds of meters deeper than it was in 1967, entombed permanently in a moving glacier, effectively removed from any environment that intersected with the surface world. The ice would be its own burial vault, clean, permanent, and free. What they left behind was not clean. The declassified inventory compiled after the site's existence was officially acknowledged includes figures that define the scale of the problem. Approximately 200,000 liters of diesel fuel were left in storage tanks inside the tunnels. Roughly 240,000 liters of liquid waste, primarily sewage, from the camp's biological systems during its years of occupation, were deposited directly into melt wells drilled into the ice beneath the facility. Tens of thousands of liters of other chemical waste, including polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs, which were widely used as electrical insulating fluid in the camp's power distribution systems, were left in place. The PCB contamination is particularly significant. PCBs are persistent organic pollutants that do not biodegrade in cold environments. They accumulate in biological tissue and are acutely toxic to a wide range of Arctic ecosystems. There is also the matter of the reactor. The fuel rods from the PM-2A reactor were removed before abandonment. This is on the record. But the reactor vessel itself, the primary coolant loops, the secondary coolant infrastructure, and all the materials that had been in proximity to the reactor core during its years of operation were not removed. Low-level radioactive material in the form of contaminated equipment, coolant residues, and structural materials that had absorbed neutron radiation during the reactor's operational life remained inside the mechanical tunnel. The Army classified these materials as low-level radioactive waste under the disposal standards of 1967. Under the standards of 1967, entombing them in a moving glacier was considered adequate. When the Danish government and the global scientific community eventually learned the full contents of what had been left inside Camp Century, the response was not measured. The documents describing the full scope of Project Iceworm and the precise nature of the abandoned material were not declassified by the United States government until 1995 and 1996. For nearly 30 years after the camp was abandoned, the Danish government was not officially informed that a weapons program had been conducted on their sovereign territory without their knowledge or consent. They were not officially informed that 200,000 liters of diesel fuel and an inventory of radioactive waste were sitting under their ice sheet. The political fallout when the declassification occurred was severe and remains unresolved. The Danish government lodged formal protests with the United States, the Greenlandic people, the indigenous Inuit population whose territory had been used as the staging ground for this deception, voiced deep and sustained outrage. The base at Thule in northwestern Greenland, which had been the logistical hub supporting Camp Century operations, had been established in the 1950s by forcibly relocating the indigenous Inuit community of Qaanaaq, an action whose human costs had also been concealed from the Danish government at the time. The full history of American Arctic military activity on Greenland was beginning to emerge as a catalog of sovereign violations. But the legal and political dimensions of this history became secondary to a scientific problem that no diplomatic negotiation could resolve. In 2016, a team of researchers from York University in Canada published findings in the journal Geophysical Research Letters that reframed the Camp Century legacy entirely. Their analysis, using updated glaciological modeling and climate projection data, reached a conclusion that overturned the foundational assumption of the 1967 abandonment decision. The ice above Camp Century is melting. The glaciological models used in the original 1967 assessment assumed that annual snowfall in northwestern Greenland would continue to exceed annual surface melt, meaning the net ice balance above the camp would remain positive. The glacier would continue to thicken. The abandoned camp would continue to be buried deeper. The 2016 study found that under current climate trajectory projections, the net ice balance in that region of the Greenland ice sheet will reverse within this century. The surface will begin losing more ice to melting each year than it gains from snowfall. The glacier will thin, and as the glacier thins, the material at Camp Century will rise toward the surface. The researchers estimated that under mid-range warming scenarios, Camp Century could begin re-entering the surface environment within the latter half of this century. The diesel, the PCBs, the sewage, and the low-level radioactive material left inside the tunnels in 1967, under the assumption that they would never re-enter the biosphere, may begin to emerge within the lifetimes of people alive today. The engineering irony here is total. The Greenland ice sheet was chosen as the site for Project Iceworm because its extreme climate made it the most isolated and stable environment on Earth. The assumption was that what went into the ice stayed in the ice. The project was abandoned because the ice was too dynamic at human engineering timescales, flowing and deforming in ways that prevented the construction of a stable tunnel network. Now, at a longer environmental timescale, the ice is proving to be insufficiently permanent in the opposite direction. It is not only moving horizontally, it is retreating vertically. And the retreat is being driven by the same industrial civilization that built the nuclear reactors, manufactured the PCBs, and drilled the waste wells in the first place. Who is responsible for what happens when the contaminated material emerges? This is a legal and political question with no precedent and no clear answer. The United States government's position has been that the 1951 Defense Treaty, under which Camp Century was established, contains no explicit provision addressing environmental liability for abandoned military infrastructure. The Danish government's position is that the material was placed on Danish sovereign territory without Danish consent, and that the United States bears full responsibility for whatever remediation is required. The government of Greenland, which has been moving toward greater autonomy from Denmark, has its own claims and its own political stakes. No binding international agreement currently exists that determines who funds the cleanup. No cleanup has been initiated. No detailed site survey using modern drilling and sensing equipment has been conducted since the camp was abandoned in 1967. The current state of the infrastructure inside those tunnels, what has collapsed, what has been crushed by ice deformation, what has leaked, what has migrated through the ice, these are questions for which there are no current answers. There's material frozen in the Greenland ice sheet right now at this moment, whose contents, location, and integrity are entirely unknown. It was put there by the United States government, without the knowledge of the nation that owns the land, as a cover for a weapons program that violated an existing treaty. And it was left there under an assumption about the permanence of ice that the climate has since invalidated. What remains of Camp Century is a perfectly constructed historical argument about the limits of strategic confidence. The planners of Project Iceworm were extraordinarily sophisticated people. They were not reckless or carelessly destructive. They were operating inside the most well-funded and technically advanced military bureaucracy on Earth at the height of its institutional power, doing exactly what they were ordered to do with the best available knowledge and engineering capability of their time. They built a nuclear reactor under a glacier. They sustained 200 men in a subterranean city in the Arctic for years. They solved engineering problems that had never been faced by any construction team in human history. And they made one foundational assumption that seemed, at the time, to be the most conservative and stable assumption available to them. They assumed the ice would last. What they could not account for, because the scientific consensus of their era had not yet understood it, was that the atmosphere above their frozen burial vault was already accumulating the industrial gases that would eventually begin to melt it. The industrial civilization that built Camp Century was, simultaneously, setting in motion the process that will one day expose it. Defense historians and environmental scientists continue to debate the precise timeline and scope of the contamination event. Some analyses suggest that ice movement rather than surface melt may be the more immediate vector. That the flowing glacier could carry contaminated material toward the ice sheet's coastal margins on a faster schedule than vertical surface melt alone would suggest. Others argue that natural containment within the deforming ice may actually inhibit the migration of contaminants in ways that make surface exposure the more significant long-term threat. The variables are enormous and the modeling uncertainties are real. What is not uncertain is the archaeology. Beneath approximately 35 meters of accumulated snow and ice on the northwest coast of Greenland, there's an army base. It has a movie theater. It has a barbershop. It has a church, a hospital, a library, and the tunnel framework of a nuclear missile deployment system that would have permanently altered the strategic geography of the Cold War if the ice had held its shape. It has 200,000 liters of diesel fuel and an inventory of chemical and radioactive waste that has never been removed. It is a reactor vessel that operated for 6 years and has sat unmonitored in total darkness for nearly 6 decades. And it is getting closer to the surface every year. The story of Camp Century is not simply a Cold War story. It is not simply a story about geopolitical deception or treaty violations or the engineering hubris of a superpower at the peak of its confidence. It is a story about the foundational assumption that underlies all long-term strategic planning, that the physical environment will remain as it is. The Arctic was chosen because it seemed permanent. The ice sheet was chosen because it seemed eternal. The burial of hundreds of thousands of liters of chemical waste in a glacier was acceptable in 1967 because no responsible scientific institution believed in 1967 that the glacier would be retreating by 2050. The ice does not care what was assumed about it. That is what the ice is still hiding. Not just the diesel tanks and the PCBs and the reactor housing and the ghosts of a weapons program that was never authorized by the people whose territory it occupied. It is hiding the record of a confidence. The confidence that the physical world would remain stable enough, long enough, to make the consequences of what was buried there someone else's problem. The ice sheet is making that calculation visible. And the bill for the confidence of 1967 has not yet been delivered.